Hilchos Eiruvin Perek Revi'i, the laws of the Eiruv, chapter 4. Today we conclude the discussion on the Eiruv Shacharis, the idea that when there are a number of residents living in a courtyard and they all have access to a public space, they cannot carry in that courtyard, in that public space, until they make an Eiruv. They all chip in together with some food and declare that the same way we equally own the public space, we all equally own our private homes, such that the entire thing is converted into one big private domain and everybody can carry there. And today the topic is, firstly, certain cases where, although there are different homes in the courtyard, if they meet certain conditions, those homes can be considered as one entity, and no Eruv is required at all. The Rambam will give us some cases about that. And then the second half of the chapter, the Rambam will talk about cases that may interrupt the Eruv. Someone's dying, people forgot to make an Eruv, setups of different types of adjacent courtyards that have different types of openings to the public domain, and how that interplays with the laws of the Eiruv Shacharis. And without further ado, let's get right to it. Halacha Aleph, Anshe Chatzer shehayu kulam oichlin al shulchan echad. Members of a courtyard who all ate together at the same table. They have different homes, but for meals they're always together. Afal pi shekol echad ve'echad yesh le bayis bifnei atzma, even though every individual has his own home. Ein tzrichin Eruv, they don't require to make an Eruv in order to carry on the Shabbos in their shared courtyard. Mipnei shehin ka'anshe bayis echad, because the fact that they eat together turns them into members of one home. The same way within one home. We never say that the fact that a person has a wife or kids or slaves prohibits him from carrying in his domain, and he need not make an Eruv with them. So too these people who are all eating together are considered to be members of one home, because they are all relying on one table. The Rebbe once spoke about this halacha in a mystical term. You know, it says that the Jewish people are called banim hasmuchim al shulchan avihem, children who are at the table of their father. We're always considered connected to Hashem. We're all at one table, even in galut, even in exile. Our neshamas remain united. And because of that, even though it looks like each Jew is living in his own home, but because we have shulchan echad, because we have one table, we're considered to be ka'anshe bayis echad, like members of one home. And the Rebbe explained why the Rambam uses the word shulchan. Shulchan is representative of a person's mainstay. You may have a home with tons of possessions and different things, but where you eat, that's where everything goes down. For a Jew, what is a Jew's table? A Jew's table is his connection to Torah and mitzvahs. So the idea is that if Jews are connected to the Torah and mitzvahs, if we're at one table, no matter what else we have going on, that connects every single Jew together. The commentaries actually note that it doesn't have to be actually at one table. Let's say they have a room and there's two or three tables. Bottom line is makom pita, is the words of the commentary. The place of the bread is all the same. Everyone's coming to the same room to eat. And it also matches in the mystical concept, because not every Jew is at the same table spiritually. Typically we have two types of Jews, Yisachar and Zvulun, people that are more involved in Torah, people that are more involved in business. Two general pursuits. And nevertheless, because makom pita, because the place of our bread, the point of it all, the purpose which we live with is all shared, that's enough to make the Jewish people considered to be together. And this achieves a greater level of achdut than typically. Typically you have to have an Eruv. An Eruv means you got to do something to bring two Jews together. But when you're at the same table, which means when a Jew is living his life in alignment with Hashem's will through Torah and mitzvahs, nothing else is needed. The unity is created in and of itself between him and all other Jews. So it's a much deeper level of achdut Yisrael, a much deeper level of appreciation of Jewish unity. This was the Rebbe's take on this halacha in Rambam. Halacha Beis, now we return to the legality of it. V'chein, similarly, when you have such a courtyard who all share their food, and because of that they become one home, if the members of this courtyard find themselves in need of making an Eruv together with an adjacent courtyard, because we've seen before that just like you have an Eruv within a courtyard, a number of courtyards can also make an Eruv, which allows them to all carry within each other. So if they needed to make an Eruv with another courtyard, Eruv echad lekulan, they only have to chip in one entity of the Eruv on behalf of them all. Typically, every home that participates in an Eruv has to give its own loaf of bread. But over here, because all of these homes are considered to be one home anyway because they eat together, upas acha, says the Rambam, only one loaf of bread is required, bilvad, alone, do they have to bring to the place where the Eruv is being collected. If the Eruv is being hosted in their courtyard, we saw in the other chapter that the Eruv, the house that hosts the Eruv, doesn't have to contribute to the Eruv. Here, because the entire courtyard is considered as one because of the fact that they eat together, so it's considered like one home hosting the Eruv. And if the other courtyard wants to host the Eruv by them, einon tzrichin la'arev. they don't have to contribute to the Eruv. The same way every time you have a home that hosts the Eruv doesn't have to give to the bread. The Rambam again reiterates, all of the homes here are considered to be one home. The same applies to a regular courtyard. Different residents, different homes, and they made an Eruv. The accomplishment, halachically, of making an Eruv is such that it turns you really into one home. Nasu kulan kebayis, they all become like one home. And now, if this courtyard who made an Eruv needs to join with another courtyard's Eruv, they only have to pass on one loaf of bread on behalf of them all to the place where the Eruv is going to be kept. And if they were going to be the host of the Eruv, again, they don't have to contribute the bread because they've all become one home by virtue of the Eruv which they've made first on their own. Halacha Dalet. It's not only eating together which can bring people together halachically. If there were 5 people who were appointed as the collectors, they were walking around the entire courtyard to get the bread from everybody to bring to wherever the Eruv was going to be hosted. When they then transfer all the collected food to the place of the Eruv, on behalf of the 5 of them, they're only required to give 1 loaf of bread. Because they collected the food together, these 5 people become like one home. And they only have to give 1 loaf, of bread on behalf of them all. Halacha Hey, the Rambam goes even further. Ha'avu v'nai, you have a father and son. Ha'rav v'talmidai, a teacher, an expert teacher, and his student. Such a teacher which the student can claim he learned most of his wisdom from this teacher. Shehin shruyin b'chatzar, and they're living together in a courtyard, each in their own home. Einon tzrichin la'ardev, they do not need to make an eruv for them to be able to carry in the shared courtyard. Mipnei shehin kebayis echad, the familial bond, and the bond created by Torah. Think about that. A teacher can teach a student Torah, and through that becomes so connected with him that it becomes like one home. Even though sometimes they eat at the same table and sometimes they don't. Let's say it's an older son, teacher and student are living separately, but because of the family and Torah ties, they become like one home. Says the Rambam halacha vav. There's a courtyard with a number of brothers living there. Each one has his own home. And they do not rely on the table of their father. They're mature, they're married, they have families, they live on their own. And if you had a scenario where there was a wife or a slave who doesn't eat constantly at the table of her husband or their master. Talmud talks about this. This was arranged in many marriages in times of old. Sometimes women would always eat with their husbands. Other times they had their own residences where they would eat all week, and only on Shabbos they would join, or only on specific times of year they would join their husbands. Same with slaves and masters. So here we have somewhat of a connection. You're talking about brothers, they're all related, but they all got their own home and they don't always eat together. You got a woman and her husband, but they don't always eat together. They eat at his table, women at her husband's table, slave at a master's table, as pay for certain services or work that they do. Or as a favor, yamim yaduim, but it's just on specific days, specific intervals. Like somebody who would eat by his friend for a week or a month. If I travel for a month to a different country and I'm eating by my friend's house, doesn't mean I became a member of his household. He's being gracious to me and hosting me for a month. It's a very specific time period. Same with this woman, same with the slave, same with the brothers. They're mixed in some way, but they're not in other ways. They only have specific times when they meet. So the level to which they're considered to be one home depends on whether there's other people in the courtyard. Are they the only people in this courtyard or not? Says the Rambam, if there's no other residents in this courtyard, they don't have to make an Eruv together, because we look at the part that unites them, the fact that they do eat sometimes together, and that makes them like one home. And if they're going to make an Eruv with an adjoining courtyard, same thing. Eruv echad lekulan, they only have to provide one Eruv on behalf of them all. If the Eruv is being hosted by them, they don't have to give bread. But if there were other residents living in this courtyard besides for this group of brothers, or besides for this husband and wife, or besides for this slave and this master, then we look at the part that separates them, the fact that they don't always eat together. They're going to require their own individual loaves of bread, like everybody else in the courtyard will require their own loaves of bread. Because they're not constantly on the same table. And so we have to look at the element that separates them. We have to say, hey, they're not always eating together, so That's the part that we're going to look at. Halacha Zayin. Chamesh chavures sheshavsu b'trak lenechad. 5 groups of people are spending Shabbos in one big hall. It's a big structure. It's only one building, but there are some division between them. If there was a partition between each group that reaches all the way to the ceiling, every group is considered to be in its own room or its own story of the home. Therefore, if they want to join an Eruv, every group needs to provide its own loaf of bread. But if the partitions dividing between them do not reach the ceiling, Kikar echad lekulan, one loaf only is required on behalf of them all. Shekulan kan shebayis echad chashuvin, because they're all considered members of one home. Halacha ches says the Rambam, mi sheyesh le b'chatzar chaverei beis shar. Somebody who has, in the courtyard of his friend, any one of the following structures. Beis shar sherabim dersim bay. Beis shar is that gateway. It's like that building we showed the other day, kind of like in the middle of the wall. It's really a passageway, but you could technically spend some time there. So it's a beis shar, it's a home within the gate, sherabim dersin bay, which most people go through. Or that little patio between the two homes. Mir peses, or the porch that we saw yesterday. This is the pretty detailed type of porch. It's a porch that comes out of a second floor, and there's also stairs to a third floor. Or a place for a barn, or a place for straw, or a place for wood, or other type of storage house. The fact that you have such a home, such a residence, in a friend's courtyard, you don't prohibit your friend from carrying. You're not considered to be a member of the courtyard just because you have such a structure in that courtyard. There needs to be for you a place of dwelling, where you rely on to eat bread there. And then you prohibit your friend from carrying until you make an Eruv with him. But if it's simply a place where you sleep, that's not considered enough to be dwelling there, and you don't count as a member of the courtyard. Therefore, if you set up yourself a place to eat in that gateway home, or in that patio, or in the porch, just because you eat there doesn't give you the power to prohibit your friend, because it isn't a place to dwelling. Dwelling has to encompass everything. It's got to be a full-on thing, and you have to use it to eat. Can't just be sleeping, it can't just be eating. It's got to be everything together, a full living quarters. Once you have a full living quarters, you're considered a full-fledged member of the courtyard, and if you don't take part in the Eruv, you prohibit everybody else from carrying in the shared space. Halacha tes asara batim zelifni mizeh. There's 10 homes, one within each other. In other words, each one leads to the other. You need to access the outermost one to get into the deeper homes, or the deeper rooms, let's call them. Habayis hapnimi v'hasheni loy, heim shenois nenesa Eruv. Only the innermost home and the one second to it need to contribute to the Eruv, which is going to allow them to carry within the space. The 8 outer homes, the 8 outer rooms, do not even have to provide anything for the Eruv. Since there is a multitude of people, in this case more than 2 people, that's passing through them, there's at least one person passing through every one of the 8 outer homes until they get to the last 2. The last 2 only have 2 people passing through them. The last one only has 1 person, in fact. He's the only one that lives there. But from the 8th home and onwards, they all have Rabim Dersin Bahem, multitudes passing through them. Harehim Kebeis Shar. So we look at those outer rooms as a gateway. The Hadar Bebeis Shar, we just said, a person who lives in a home in a gateway isn't considered to prohibit others from carrying. Aval Hachi, but the 9th one, Ein Dersin Beirabim Alayachid. There aren't multiple people passing through there. It's only him and the other guy who's passing through the 10th home. Therefore, he does prohibit everybody from carrying unless he contributes to the Eruv. So only 2 of the rooms, the 2 innermost rooms, will have to contribute to the Eruv in this case. Halacha Yud. And here we have a diagram. Shtei chatzeres, you have 2 courtyards on the side. Ubeinehen shleisha batim psuchim zalazeh upsuchim lachatzeres. And between them, in the alley between them, you have 3 plain homes. Those homes aren't in a courtyard. There is no enclosed space enclosing them. There's 2 enclosed courtyards. And next, in the middle, there's 3 homes. The 3 homes are open to each other. You can see the doorways in between, and they're open to the courtyards on the sides. So in a way, we have a little ches shape going on. If you start in one courtyard, you can walk literally through the 3 homes and into the other courtyard. Let's say the members of the first courtyard on the right brought their collected Eruv food through the home which is open to them, and they place it in the middle home, the home in the middle right over there. The members of the other courtyard on the left brought the Eruv through the home open to them. And they also put it in the middle home. So the middle home is now being the host for the two Eruvs of the courtyards on each side. All three of those homes don't need to contribute to the Eruv, even though only one is hosting. And typically only the host's home doesn't have to contribute. So why do the two side homes not have to contribute? Okay, the middle home we understand. The Eruv was placed there. The place that hosts doesn't contribute. But the two on the side, we treat each one as a gateway for the members of the courtyard. The members of the courtyard only cared about the middle home. That's where they hosted their Eruv. To get there, they had to pass through the side homes. So the side homes, in effect, became a gateway to get into the middle home. A gateway doesn't have to contribute to an Eruv. Halacha Yud Aleph, little variation to this case. Two courtyards and two homes open to each other between them and open to the courtyards as well. Each courtyard took their Eruv and brought it to the home that was further from them. So the right courtyard went through the right home, put their Eruv in the left home. The left courtyard went through the left home and put their Eruv in the right home. Let's see it inside. Each This one brought their Eruv through the home that's closer to them and put it in the second home, closer to the other courtyard. And this courtyard took their Eruv through the home closer to them and put it in the other home. Neither Eruv works. Because each person hosted his Eruv in a place which isn't considered to be a home. Think about it. The right courtyard treated the right home as a gateway to get to the left home where they were going to host their Eruv. So now that right home is converted into a gateway. A gateway isn't a proper home. So when the left home goes through the left, when the left courtyard goes through the left home to put their Eruv in the right home, they're essentially putting their Eruv in a gateway which doesn't count. And the same holds true for the right home. Because the left home put their Eruv in the right home and used the left home as a gateway, so the left home turned into a gateway. So when the right courtyard puts their Eruv in the left home, they're putting their Eruv in a gateway, and it doesn't count. Halacha Yud Beis. If there was somebody in the courtyard who was on the verge of death, Geises is the halachic term for basically out the door. Even though there's no way he's going to survive the day. The fact that he is not contributing to the Eruv will stop the rest of the members of the Eruv from carrying. And therefore, they must acquire on his behalf some bread and do the Eruv for him. Also a child. Even if he's so small, he cannot eat an olive-sized amount of food. The fact that he exists and is a resident in the home, and let's say it's his own home, his father, let's say, died, left him, so he's the only heir. He prohibits others from carrying in the courtyard until they do an Eruv on his behalf. But a guest never prohibits others from carrying, as we explained. There's a courtyard, 4 or 5 homes in the courtyard. One of the members of the courtyard went away for Shabbos. He's spending Shabbos in a different courtyard. Even if it was right next to the courtyard. He literally moved 3 steps away. If he has diverted his mind and he doesn't have no plans to return to his home on the Shabbos, his original home, his presence or the fact that he owns a home in the courtyard makes no difference. It doesn't stop the rest of the people in the courtyard from carrying through their Eruv. He doesn't have to participate. But that's only said if he's a Jew. But if it's a non-Jew, an idol-worshipping non-Jew, even if he went to a different city for Shabbos, the fact that he has a home in this courtyard prohibits all the rest of the Jews from carrying, until, as we saw in chapter 2, until they rent his property from him. There's no such thing as a non-Jew saying, I diverted my mind, I'm not coming back on Shabbos. It's always accessible. He can travel, he can do work. He can come back on Shabbos, and if he does, the second he's there, his presence will forbid them. So even when he's not there, the fact that he has a home forbids them from carrying. Let's say you have a landlord, and he owns a number of homes in the courtyard, and he rents out some of the homes to other people. But he left a mark. In every one of his homes, there are some vessels that belong to him. some produce, some merchandise that belongs to him. Einan oisrin alav. The rest of the people's presence in the courtyard, the tenants, do not forbid the landlord from carrying in the space. It's all considered to be his because he left his mark in every home. And since he has authority in each of the homes, everybody is called his guests. Not only are they his tenants, but for Shabbos they're his guests. And he's the only owner of the domain. He can carry in the domain, and so can they. But that's again only if one of the things that he left there, his merchandise or his wares, were things that could not be moved on Shabbos. We spent in the laws of Shabbos, chapter 24, 25, 26, talking about muktzah, different things that can and cannot be used on Shabbos, moved on Shabbos. So if it's something that cannot be moved on Shabbos, for example, untithed produce or slabs of metal, that's for sure going to stay there over Shabbos. So his authority is going to be in every home over Shabbos. But if the only mark the landlord left in the tenant's homes is the fact that he has some movable items on the Shabbos, things in the home that belong to the landlord can be moved on the Shabbos, since technically it's possible for the landlord to go into the home and remove those vessels and leave no more trace of himself in every one of the homes. The fact now that there are tenants in these homes prohibit the landlord from carrying, and they all must join together to make an Eruv. People living in a courtyard, they forgot. They didn't make an Eruv. That's it, it's over. You can't carry from the homes to the courtyard, you can't carry from the courtyard to the homes. But any articles that began Shabbos outside in the courtyard may be moved around in the entire courtyard and in any areas that are considered connected to the courtyard. As we saw the other day, that all the roofs of an entire city, you can, as long as the article began Shabbos outside, you can move vessels from one courtyard to the other, to the roofs, to the enclosed areas, etc. Now, if in this courtyard there was a little porch, like we had before, second story, and it wasn't like they forgot to make an Eruv, but they made mini Eruvs. The people on the ground level of the courtyard made their own Eruv. People living on the higher levels in the porches in the second story, they made their own Eruv. So then it counts for them. Anshe Amir Peses, Anshe Ha'aliyah, the people living on the second story or in the porch, Mitaltalin Kelim Shashavsu Bevateyan, Bechal Amir Peses, Uvechala Nechshavima. They can move their articles that began Shabbos in their home, they can take them out to the porch and to any part of the courtyard which is considered to be part of the porch. Or in the entirety of the second story, and whatever is considered to be adjacent to it. The Anshe HaChatzar, people on the ground floor who made their own Eruv, Metatalin B'chal HaChatzar or B'chal HaNechshavima, can move things around in the courtyard and in every part that's considered part of the courtyard. Same applies if it's just one-on-one. One guy living on the ground floor, one guy living on the top floor. They forgot they didn't make an Eruv together. The guy on top can carry in his entirety of the second story and whatever is considered to be part of the second story. And the bottom guy, the ground floor guy, can carry on the ground floor and anything considered to be part of the ground floor. Ketzad, what does it mean, anything considered to be part of the ground floor? Like, are there different things that are not part of the ground floor? So the Rambam gives a couple of scenarios where things could be on the ground but considered belonging to the second story, or vice versa. So a couple of examples. Let's say you have a massive rock or a massive mound of earth sitting in the middle of the courtyard on the ground. If they're not 10 tfachim high, they haven't assumed their own identity yet, and they're not tall enough to be easily accessible to the porch members. It's considered middle ground. It's considered belonging to both the ground level and the higher level. And neither of them can make use of it by transferring stuff from their homes onto this rock or onto this mound. We had this principle the other day as well. Whenever you have a space that's equally accessible by two courtyards, the fact that they can both use it actually forbids them both from using it unless they make an Eruv over it. So here you have a rock. It's not 10 tfachim high, so it's neither here nor there. It belongs to both, so both can't use it. But that's on the right side, right? So less than 10 tfachim. Now on the left side, the rock or the mound of earth is 10 tfachim high. And if you drew a line on the ground, it's less than 4 tfachim removed from the porch. See that over there? Porch level ends over here. If you draw a line downwards, and then from there to the rock, it's less than 4 tfachim. So, even though the rock or the mound is on the bottom floor, but because it's 10 tfachim high, very close to the top, and it's within 4 tfachim, easily accessible, it belongs to the top floor. Because they're on equal ground with it. Equal ground meaning it's more than 10 tfachim. It's out of the lower entity's realm. And the people of the higher porch can use the rock or the mound. But if, like you have in the bottom picture, the rock was 10 tfachim tall. But if you measured from where the end of the porch came down to where the rock begins, there's more than 4 tfachim. So then, even though it's 10 tfachim tall, now it doesn't belong to the porch exclusively. It doesn't belong to the courtyard exclusively either because it's 10 tfachim tall. But what we do is, it goes back to the forbidden position. It's included to belong to both to the courtyard and to the porch, because both of them can make use of the rock by throwing. People on the ground, even though it's 10 tfachim tall, can throw stuff onto it. People on top can also throw stuff onto it. Both domains cannot carry things onto the rock or mound until they do an Eruv. If there was some kind of structure jutting out of the porch 4 tfachim wide, and you can see this over here, it's kind of inwards on the porch. They built all along the porch level a matzeva, is like a little ledge coming out. That's a declaration of complete separation of property. We want nothing to do with you. We're building our own ledge into our own property. Now the porch doesn't prohibit the people of the ground level courtyard from carrying it all. Because they have separated themselves, they've distinguished themselves from them. If you have ledges coming out of the walls, and again, in a courtyard where you have 2 stories, any ledge lower than 10 tfachim from the ground, is part of the courtyard. The members of the courtyard can use it. And whatever is within the 10 tfachim, from the highest 10 tfachim, closest to the second story, and by the members of the second story use it. But if there are ledges coming out anywhere in the space after the first 10 tfachim, before the last 10 tfachim, that's considered equal. Both are forbidden to make use of it. And you cannot use on those ledges any vessels that came from the homes of either the bottom or the top floor until they make an Eruv. A pit is sitting in the middle of the courtyard. If it was full of produce that's untithed, and therefore cannot be moved on the Shabbos, the entire pit, as well as the sand pile, the protective sand pile around the pit, is treated like the rock or the mound we just discussed in Halakha Tet Zayin. If it was 10 tfachim tall and within 4 tfachim of the porch, close to the porch, it's part of the porch. But if it was full of water, stuff that could be used on the Shabbos, neither members of the ground floor courtyard or the members of the upper story cannot make use of the pit because they both have access, and when both have access, they forbid each other from using it unless they make an Eruv. You have 2 courtyards, one within the other, which means there's only one way to get to the public domain, through the outer courtyard. That's called the Chatzar HaPnimis, the inner courtyard. This is the Chatzar HaChitzona, the outer courtyard. To get to the public domain, everybody has to traverse the outer courtyard. Of course, members of the outer courtyard go out through their door. And even the members of the inner courtyard go through the outer courtyard to get to the street. That's called Drisat HaRegel in the Talmud, stepping of the foot. They have right of passage through the outer courtyard, and therefore they can affect the laws of the outer courtyard as it pertains to carrying. And the Rambam goes as follows. 2 courtyards, one within the other. The members of the inner courtyard must pass out and go in and pass by the outer courtyard. So let's say before Shabbos, only the members of the inner courtyard made their own Eruv, and the members of the outer courtyard did not. The inner courtyard, since it's never affected by the outer one, they live in their own bubble. Nobody goes into their courtyard besides for them. The fact that they made an Eruv in their courtyard is helpful and allows them to carry within their space. And of course, the outer courtyard remains forbidden since they didn't make an Eruv. But if the outer courtyard was the only one to make an Eruv, and the members of the inner courtyard did not, now the members of the inner courtyard messed not only themselves up, but also the members of the outer courtyard. Both courtyards are forbidden to carry him. Hapnimis, the inner courtyard cannot carry, of course, didn't make an Eruv. The Hachitzoina and the outer courtyard cannot carry in their domain, because the people who did not make an Eruv must pass through their courtyard, and they become quasi-residents almost. So even though all the residents of all the homes living in this courtyard made the Eruv, because you have Drisat HaRegel, stepping of the foot, rite of passage, coming from the top into their courtyard, and they are people that are not allowed to carry, they mess everybody up. Halacha continues the Rambam. Ervu zula atzma v'zula atzma. If each courtyard made their own Eruv, zu muteres b'fnei atzma v'zu muteres b'fnei atzma. Each courtyard remains permitted on its own. Aval ein mitatlin mizula zu, but we cannot carry from one to the other. This is a little puzzling, because based on the principles we just said before, the fact of the matter remains that the people in the inner courtyard are going to pass through the outer courtyard where they're not allowed to carry, because they weren't part of the outer courtyard's Eruv. Nevertheless, the Talmud has the principle that's called regel hamuteret bimkoma. When a foot can move about in its own place, it's also allowed to, it doesn't affect badly people in another place. The fact that the inner courtyard is allowed to carry because they've made their own Eruv, now they have their own little place and it doesn't disturb the outer courtyard as well. So because they have their own Eruv, they don't mess up other people's Eruvs. Halacha chav, shachach echad min hachitzena v'lei Eruv. If one member in the outer courtyard didn't make an Eruv, hapnimis behetera emedas. The inner courtyard remains in its state of permissibility and they can carry. Shachach echad min bnei hapnimis v'lei Eruv imahin. But again, if the inner courtyard, even one guy slipped out of the Eruv, didn't make it, af hachitzena asura, that makes the entire outer courtyard also messed up. Because one guy missed the Eruv in the inner courtyard, he messes it up for everybody else. Now the whole inner courtyard's Eruv is considered cancelled. It's as though they have no Eruv. And in the case where the inner courtyard has no Eruv, now when they're going to be passing through the outer courtyard, they're going to mess up the outer courtyard's Eruv as well. Because they pass by them. Halacha chaf aleph asu shtein Eruv echad. If both courtyards join to make one Eruv, im hinichuhu b'chitzayna, if they hosted the Eruv in the outer courtyard, b'shachach echad me'en v'lei Eruv, and one of the members of these two courtyards didn't participate in the Eruv because he forgot, bein shayim mibnei achitzayna, bein mibnei apnimis, no matter who he was from, the inner or the outer courtyard, shtein asures ad sheyivate lehen, both of them remain forbidden until he cancels, nullifies his ownership of his possession to them. We've explained that you're allowed to nullify ownership from one courtyard to the other, as we said in chapter 2. But if they hosted this joint Eruv in the inner courtyard, and one of the members of the outer courtyard hadn't joined, the outer courtyard is indeed forbidden. One guy dropped out of the Eruv. The inner courtyard remains permitted because everybody made the Eruv and the Eruv is hosted by them. But if one of the members of the inner courtyard didn't make the Eruv and the Eruv was being hosted by them, both become again forbidden until the one guy who didn't take part in the Eruv nullifies ownership of his possession to them, and that allows him to be considered their guest, and now everybody can carry Shalom al Yisrael. Halacha chav beis. It wasn't an inner courtyard and outer courtyard with multiple people. It was one guy in the inner courtyard, one guy in the outer courtyard. They don't have to make an Eruv at all. Each person can use his entire courtyard. But if it was an idol-worshipping Gentile in the inner courtyard, even though he's only one guy, one idol-worshipping Gentile is considered to be a multitude of people in this sense. And he forbids the outer guy from carrying in his courtyard until he rents the property from the non-Jew. You have three courtyards open one to another, and as the commentaries explain it, they're also each individually opened to the public domain. So each courtyard has two openings, one to the public domain and one to the other adjacent courtyard. And there is a multitude of people, more than one, in every one of the courtyards. The two side courtyards join in an Eruv with the middle. They don't join together, the two extreme ones. Let's call it the right one joins with the middle one, and the left one joins with the middle one. So of course the middle one gains all the benefits. It can carry to all the side courtyards, and the side courtyards can carry to the middle one. But the two outer courtyards may not carry one into the other. unless all three join in one big Eruv. Now here, although the Rambam doesn't change the case, the commentaries explain, now we're talking about a case where the same three courtyards are open to each other, but there's only one opening to the public domain. If in every courtyard lived only one person, even though that's going to create a situation where a multitude of people are stepping into the outer courtyard, because again, as I just explained, we're talking about a case where there's only one way out to the public domain, everybody's got to step through the outer one to get to the public domain. They do not require an Eruv. Because each individual is permitted to use his own place. Kind of like the last case with the two courtyards. When it's one guy in each courtyard, each one's fine. So to here, when there's three, same thing applies. But if there were to be two people in the inner courtyard, since they for themselves require an Eruv, and without an Eruv they'd be forbidden to carry in their domain, they also forbid the individuals in the middle and outer courtyards from carrying until they join the Eruv with the two in the inner guy. This is the rule. And here's the expression that I borrowed from the Talmud before. The Rambam brings it up over here. Regel ha'asura b'mekayma. The foot that cannot walk about in its own possession, in its own domain, oiseres shalei b'mekayma. Forbids by virtue of its presence, even not in its place. So the two courtyards before, because the inner courtyard couldn't carry, if it didn't make an Eruv, when it steps into the outer courtyard, it messes them up too. V'regel ha'muteres b'mekayma. But a foot which is allowed to move about in its own place, like the inner courtyard where there's only one guy, so he can move about, or the case where they all made an Eruv, so the inner courtyard has an Eruv, and they're permitted to walk about in their own domain. Eina oiseres shalei b'mekayma does not prohibit other people that are not in its domain from walking around in their domain, mipnei she'averes alein, just because it passes through them. Halacha chav dalet. Shtei kitzutz teriyos zu l'mayla mizu. You have two balconies, one on top of the other. There we see two balconies, literally one on top of the other. And in turn, both balconies are on top of water. Like we saw earlier in the laws of Shabbat, many people would have sometimes ledges going over water to be able to draw water from there right into their house. Even though the members of each balcony made a partition descending from their balcony, 10 tfachim, as we saw in the laws of Shabbos, that's what you have to do. When you're an individual ledge coming over the water, you have to make a partition coming down 10 tfachim to show that this is the part of the water that you want to own, so to speak. It demarcates your domain. So even though each balcony made a mechitza, a partition 10 tfachim tall, if the two balconies were within 10 tfachim of each other, they're considered to be one element, and they cannot fill up water until they make an Eruv. Because they're looked at as one ledge, one balcony. But if there was a space between the two, like you see over there, one's on top, one's on bottom, and each one made their own Eruv and also made their own partition, both can fill up water through the hole. And this follows in a certain way the same principle as the courtyard. Think about it. The top courtyard, the top balcony, can only get to the water by going through the bottom balcony. But since the top balcony has made its own Eruv, it's like a regel hamuteret bimkoma. It's a foot which can walk about in its own place, because in its own place it has an Eruv. So the fact that it traverses through the bottom balcony doesn't interrupt the process and makes no problems. Everybody can draw water. Halacha chafei. If the top one didn't make a mechitza, let's see, we have it over here. Yes, on the right side. The top balcony made no partition. The bottom balcony did. The bottom one gets messed up because of the bucket of the members of the higher balcony that are going to pass through it, and they're forbidden to carry. Same as the courtyard principle. If you don't have an Eruv and you're the inner one, or you're the top one, by passing through the bottom one, you mess them up too. If it was the opposite case, top guys that you see on the left there made the partition, bottom guys did not. The top one is allowed to fill up, no problem. Bottom one cannot. But if the members of the bottom balcony chipped in to pay for the constructed mechitza, the partition on the top balcony, So in this case, when the bottom guys forget to make their partition, but because they have a part in the upper partition, so the mess up on the bottom messes the top guys up as well. And now nobody can draw water until they make one Eruv together. You have 3 stories, one on top of the other. The top and bottom story are owned by one person, the middle story owned by another guy. If the guy on top wishes to draw some water, he should not drop something from the top to the bottom balcony through the middle one. Because you cannot bring things from your domain to another one of your domains through another domain. Like you see in the next page. This is the page that's forbidden. You can't go through the middle balcony, but you could go outside, on the side of the middle balcony. If you have 2 stories, two structures, one opposite the other, and there's one courtyard between them, under them, where they would pour sewage water or whatnot into it, they cannot make use of it till they make an Eruv, because it's a space that's equally used by both of them, and that forbids both from making usage till they make an Eruv. Also, miktasan uka bechatzer. But if one of the people made a little ditch in their courtyard, lishpech hamayim, to pour the water, so they've demarcated their own space in the courtyard. Umiktasan layasu, but the other members did not, like you see on top. The left guys made a pit. The right guys didn't make a pit. So then, the ones who made the ditch can pour to their ditch, and the other ones who didn't make the ditch cannot pour water until they make an Eruv with the other guys. But if both members, both structures, made their own ditches, each one can pour into their own ditch, even though they don't have an Eruv, because we don't consider it to be the courtyard a shared possession, because they've each marked where their part is. So they can continue to use their part with no problem, even without an Eruv.